Okay, so let's dive right into this. House Republicans are working on this, well, what they're calling a big, beautiful bill.
Yeah, it's basically a package deal, right? Pulling together President Trump's main legislative goals.
Exactly. And initially, House Speaker Mike Johnson, he set this really ambitious target, Memorial Day next year.
Ambitious is one word for it. That timeline's already looking, well, pretty shaky. Increasingly unrealistic, I'd say.
Totally. Now, the talk is maybe July 4th, but even that feels uncertain.
It does, and you really get the sense the main hurdle is internal friction within the GOP itself.
Right. We saw Senate Republicans meeting, trying to, plot a path forward for this budget reconciliation bill because it's kind of stalled out.
And maybe we should just quickly clarify that budget reconciliation, it's that special process, right? Lets them pass certain budget things in the Senate with just a simple majority. Avoids the filibuster.
Good point. It's the main tool they'd use for something like this. But yeah, the problem is getting Republicans themselves to agree. You've got conservatives demanding really deep spending cuts.
Uh-huh. And then you have the moderates who are worried, understandably, about the effects on programs like Medicaid, for instance.
So for you listening, our goal here is really to cut through some of that noise, get to the heart of the issues, what could happen, without getting totally bogged down in the weeds of legislative procedure.
Yeah, because when you step back, it's not just policy specifics. It's about these different wings of the party trying to find common ground on, well, pretty fundamental ideas about government.
And that struggle is becoming really visible. I mean, there was that anonymous GOP senator calling the whole thing a potential train wreck.
A train wreck, yeah, because they just can't get on the same page, was the quote, I think. Pretty stark language.
It really is. But then, almost immediately, you hear Senate Majority Leader John Thune talking about a meeting they had on May 7th, calling it a very constructive conversation.
That contrast says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Shows you the different viewpoints. Some are maybe seeing a way through. Others are clearly bracing for impact.
Definitely. And Senator Kevin Cramer, he seemed to be leaning towards acknowledging the difficulty. He said, this great, big, beautiful deal, his words, is very, very complicated. Maybe even trying to do too much.
Which raises an interesting strategic point he hinted at. Should they have maybe just tackled things separately?
Like what?
Well, things like extending the 2017 tax cuts, border security, defense spending increases. Maybe do those as standalone bills instead of bundling everything.
Ah, right. Like breaking it down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Exactly. Sometimes that's just easier, especially when the politics are this tricky.
Makes sense. Meanwhile, over in the House, Speaker Johnson is trying to sound pretty upbeat. He's telling people, stop doubting us, saying they'll get this job done on tax cuts and spending.
He used that horse race analogy, didn't he? 3 steps: House framework, Senate alignment, final passage. Trying to frame it as progress.
Yeah, but you have to remember how close those early steps were. That House framework vote in February. A photo finish, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the April vote to align with the Senate was super tight to 214.
It just shows how little room for error they have, Like a couple of defections and the whole thing could just collapse.
Absolutely. And it sounds like the House conservatives, they only got on board with the Senate framework because they got promises from Leader Thune about substantial spending cuts.
Right. So that demand for cuts is definitely a major factor. But the million-dollar question now is, what actually makes it into the final bill? What stays in? What gets cut out?
And Representative Ralph Norman pointed straight at the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, as a huge sticking point.
Oh, yeah. SALT. That's always contentious. It really highlights the different pressures on Republicans depending on where they're from.
Oh, so?
Well, you've got Republicans from high-tax states, think New York, New Jersey, California. Their constituents really feel the loss of that deduction, so those reps need some relief on SALT to even consider voting yes.
But then you hear conservatives like Norman basically saying, look, each individual state's going to have some pain, implying, no guarantees on SALT relief for everyone.
Right. And Speaker Johnson himself seems to be managing expectations. He talked about finding an equilibrium point on SALT that no one will be totally delighted with.
Sounds like code for get ready for a compromise nobody loves, but hopefully enough people can live with.
Pretty much. And you have folks like Representative Nicole Maliotakis really fighting for it, talking about her constituents in Staten Island and Brooklyn facing huge local tax bills.
Of course, this isn't just happening in a vacuum. The Democrats are watching closely. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries is accusing Republicans of lying to the American people about the bill.
And Representative Frank Pallone raised concerns about them potentially cooking the books on the cost and deficit impact. So, yeah, sharp partisan lines are being drawn too.
And then there's another layer. the fiscal hawks within the GOP. They're adamant this whole thing must not add to the deficit. That's a hard line for them.
Definitely. And someone like Chip Roy, the Texas Republican, he's really front and center on this, constantly talking about the national debt.
His position is kind of interesting because he's also pushing for some big tax cuts, getting rid of taxes on tips, overtime, Social Security for seniors.
Things that sound popular, for sure, but the price tag is huge. That could be, what, $2 trillion less revenue over 10 years?
Yeah, and that's on top of the $4 trillion cost just to extend the existing 2017 tax cuts.
Exactly. And Roy is very clear. He doesn't buy the argument that tax cuts just magically pay for themselves. He said, we can't have a free lunch.
So his strategy is what? Tie the two together.
Pretty much. He wants to yoke, as he put it, the tax cut extensions directly to guaranteed spending cuts. It's like a precondition. You want the tax cuts, fine, but only if we lock in these spending reductions to lower the deficit.
Okay, so what kind of spending cuts are we talking about? The House budget mentioned something like $200 billion a year in spending restraint.
Yeah, but even Roy calls that modest and describes it more as slowing the growth of spending, not actual cuts from current levels. He's really focused on entitlements and mandatory spending just ballooning.
Which inevitably brings us to programs like Medicaid, right?
Yeah.
That's where the tension really flares up.
Absolutely. Because cutting spending sounds good in theory to some, but then you face the reality of how it affects people who rely on these programs. It's a tough balancing act.
And Roy has specific ideas for Medicaid reform. He talks about the different federal funding for the ACA expansion population versus the more traditional vulnerable groups.
Right. And work requirements, he argues, that could save anywhere from $120 to $250 billion. Plus, he hammers on eliminating improper payments.
It sounds like a no-brainer, but how much potential savings are really there?
Wow.
You mentioned trillions.
Trillions, yeah. Though he did admit tackling improper payments is, really difficult in practice. It's a huge, complex system.
Still, it's part of his argument. He used that SpaceX versus NASA analogy.
Right, implying a need for, a fresh, more efficient approach. He seems to think there's a new generation of Republicans ready to tackle waste in Medicare and Medicaid. He mentioned Trump and something called DOGE. The details there were a bit unclear, but the gist was about taking on bureaucratic waste.
So what seems to be crystallizing is this. Well, maybe a philosophical split in the party.
I think so. You have this sort of, let's say, traditional focus on tax cuts as the main engine for growth. But then you have this other wing, maybe more like Roy, saying, hold on, we need to shrink government first, or at least at the same time.
So Roy's view is low, flat taxes are good, but only if government is limited.
That seems to be his core idea. Low, broad, flat taxes create growth, but you need limited government alongside it.
And this difference in philosophy could lead to a real clash between the House and Senate factions, couldn't it?
Very likely. Roy used that guardrail analogy. He basically said if a bill comes over from the Senate that's fat on taxes but weak on spending cuts, it's dead on arrival for him and his allies in the House.
That's a bold stance. And it carries risks for him, doesn't it? He could get blamed if tax cuts expire, or maybe pressured to cut a deal with Democrats.
Oh, for sure. He acknowledged that. He said there have been threats, even from within the party, suggesting they might have to work with Democrats. But he calls that a mistake, pointing to things like the IRA and tax rates.
And we know he's clashed with Trump before, right?
Yeah.
Over the debt ceiling. Trump called him an obstructionist.
He did, but Roy kind of brushes that off, suggesting it's more about mutual respect for standing your ground and then finding ways to work together later. He doesn't seem too fazed by the social media attacks.
Okay, so stepping back even further, this fight over the big, beautiful bill, it's not happening in isolation, is it? It feels like part of a bigger picture of GOP infighting.
Absolutely. That Newsweek piece back in April really highlighted how divisions have been growing, especially over foreign aid, and even challenging Speaker Johnson's leadership itself.
Right, that big aid package for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, $95 billion. But 112 Republicans voted against it. That's a huge chunk of the party.
And a lot of that opposition came from the hard-right faction arguing, why are we sending money overseas when we have problems at our own border?
That was definitely Marjorie Taylor Greene's argument when she made that move to oust Johnson. The spending levels and the Ukraine aid were her main points.
And the language being used, it's gotten really personal and sharp. You had Representative Tony Gonzalez using some pretty harsh words for colleagues who voted against the aid.
Yeah, and that whole spat between Derek Van Orden and Matt Gaetz with the name-calling Tubby, Squish. It just shows how raw things are.
Van Orden calling Gaetz, Roy, and Bob Good bullies. then Gates firing back. It's not exactly collegial.
So experts looking at this, like Todd Lamon from the University of Nottingham, they see these divisions getting worse, not better, especially after that aid vote.
Yeah, he traced it back, saying this kind of friction has been building since Boner's time, with the Freedom Caucus really changing the dynamics. For them, Johnson passing that aid, especially without tougher border stuff, was just unacceptable.
Even former Speaker McCarthy seemed to take a shot at Gates recently. It just feels like constant internal battles.
And Thomas Whalen at Boston University put it pretty starkly. He said, Johnson is basically presiding over the rubble of the GOP, quoted the House divided line.
Which brings us back to the budget bill. If they're this divided on everything else, how can they possibly come together on something this massive and complicated?
That's the core challenge. And, it's worth remembering, factions in the Republican Party aren't new, if you look back historically.
Like the progressive Republicans way back, the Reagan Coalition, the Tea Party.
Exactly. There have always been different groups. Today you've got, conservatives, moderates, libertarians, the Trump wing, the anti-Trump wing, represented by different groups like the Republican Study Committee, the Freedom Caucus, the Governance Group.
So lots of different viewpoints trying to pull the party in different directions.
Precisely. So wrapping this all up, the path for this big, beautiful bill, it's looking really, really rocky.
Yeah, you've got major disagreements on spending, that whole SALT deduction mess, and these much bigger, deeper ideological splits running through the party.
Those original deadlines, Memorial Day, even July 4th, they seem pretty unlikely at this point. The narrow House majority, the Senate dynamics, the infighting, it's all working against it.
It really feels like we're watching a significant internal struggle play out. It's not just about this one bill, it's about the future direction of the Republican Party.
And understanding that internal fight is, I think, really key to grasping the whole political landscape right now and figuring out where policy might be headed in the next few months.
So maybe the final question for you to think about is, if they can't manage to unite around this, what are the long-term consequences for the Republican Party? Definitely something to keep an eye on.